Well, if you get pushed back in a corner, like I have been sometimes, you got to fight your way out. If you don't, you're going to be back there all that time. I always said I would join working with anybody that's going my way. Now that means I don't have to go his way, but if he's going my way, I'll work with him.
All right, ladies and gents. So that was a great introduction to tonight's session of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. That is actually an excerpt from a documentary made about Miss Simkins' life in the late 1980s. And we were showing this because next Monday, of course, if you look at the schedule, there isn't a class scheduled. But every year with the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights, at some point, we actually showed that particular documentary because it's the best way to learn about Miss Simkins' life and legacy. And so what we're offering folks is a chance to actually watch the documentary as a group next Monday. I believe we're having, of course, in person and on Zoom. Is that correct? Yes. So like our regular class session, that'll be next Monday at 6:30, and we'll also have time for Q&A afterward. If you don't know too much about Miss Modjeska, I would highly recommend coming next Monday to learn more about her. One of the things about Modjeska Simkins that is important to note is that if there was a movement for human rights in the 20th century, she was involved with it. Whether it was the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, the movement against nuclear arms. If there was a movement for justice and against oppression, she was on the front lines. And this documentary that we're going to watch next week goes into great detail and depth about her life and legacy. So that'll be next Monday at 6:30. Again, there wasn't a class scheduled, but that'll be after Easter weekend. So we hope to see you here either in person or virtually. It's a great documentary.
Dr. That's a 59-minute film, so we have time for discussion now.
Yes, and trust me, you'll want to discuss it after we're done. Any questions about that at all? Any questions? Okay. All righty then. Well, before we get into tonight's conversation, we're discussing nullification, the secession crisis and Civil War, very light topics. I wanted to actually highlight a student in our class. If you read the Free Times, read it last week, you may have come across a story about Taylor Simon's Liberation is Lit pop-up bookstore. If you have not read the story, again, it is online. I'll just show my screen real quick and we'll send a link to it as well. But yeah, she was highlighted in the Free Times this past week about the work she's doing with her bookstore and trying to make it into a brick and mortar location. But this is showing how the folks who are in our school are doing a lot of incredible work. And if you take nothing else from the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights, remember that no matter what you're doing for the cause of freedom, it is helping in that particular cause, right? So whatever you can contribute, whatever you can do is not only greatly appreciated, but it will make a much greater difference than you might think. All right. So again, let's give her a round of applause. I think she's actually on Zoom this evening, but I just wanted to highlight that as well. We're going to go ahead now. And unfortunately, Taylor, we're going to segue from you to John C. Calhoun. My apologies. But tonight's class is one that I think will help to explain how the state of South Carolina ends up seceding at the beginning of the Civil War, and also ends up being an incubator for a lot of ideas on the right wing. When it comes to South Carolina history, the answer is almost always slavery and racism, no matter what the question is. And I think tonight's class is going to go a long way for proving that. Okay. So I want to actually start tonight's story again by talking about one of the most famous or perhaps infamous politician in the history of South Carolina and the American South. And that is, of course, John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun is one of those figures that still casts a shadow over American political thought, even in the early 21st century. If you're thinking about, for example, some of the origins of thoughts on the far right or the right wing in America about things such as states' rights, the relationship between the states and the federal government, some of these ideas have their origins with John C. Calhoun, which actually would have been news to Mr. Calhoun around 1825 or there. Now, Calhoun's career as a national politician actually began with him being an ardent nationalist. He deeply believed in the federal government and the primacy of the federal government in a wide range of things, in terms of commerce, in terms of internal improvements, and also in terms of foreign policy. Like a lot of other Southern congressmen in the early 19th century, Calhoun was a big proponent of westward expansion. And so he became a big supporter of America's war with Great Britain, known as the War of 1812. Now, westward expansion in this case isn't talking about going to California or Nevada or Mexico or the like. In this case, we're talking about expansion into what is now Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and even into eventually Texas. And Calhoun's support for westward expansion boils down to one very simple thing. For slavery to survive and to thrive, it needed more land, more territory, especially with the growing of cotton. Cotton is not only a labor-intensive crop, cotton was also a soil-intensive crop. It needed more soil in which to grow and to thrive. And for folks like Calhoun, they looked out west and said, there's plenty of fertile soil out west for us to grow more cotton on. After the War of 1812, he actually becomes a pretty prominent national politician. He serves 2 terms as Secretary of War under James Monroe, and then eventually becomes vice president in the 1820s. Now, typically, with a resume like this, we would think to ourselves, well, it's only a matter of time before Mr. Calhoun runs for president. Well, that's not going to happen. Because there is a theme in this course that is worth talking about right now. If you are a politician from South Carolina, you often have a decision to make. You can either remain nationally prominent, but risk being weak within South Carolina, or you can remain very strong within the Palmetto State, but risk in the process national prominence. You can't be prominent and powerful in both the nation and South Carolina. To make a long story very short, this state is too peculiar for that to happen. There is the famous saying that South Carolina is too large to be an insane asylum and too small to be a republic. The history of the state has proven that time and time again. And really the thing about Calhoun, and this is what he's remembered for historically speaking, is that Calhoun is one of the early politicians who comes up with the idea of nullification. Now, this wasn't brand new when Calhoun introduced it. As early as the 1790s, you have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison talking about the idea of maybe the states can actually interpose on certain unconstitutional laws. We're not 100% sure. But Calhoun takes this a step further, and he argues what is called the nullification theory, that a state has the right to nullify federal laws it believes are unconstitutional. Now, Calhoun's argument is really based on opposition to the tariffs of 1824 and 1828. And I don't want to slip too far into 19th century history, but one of the reasons Southerners oppose tariffs is because they see tariffs as a way to invest in Northern business, in Northern commerce. And at the same time, it's driving up prices of European-made goods that they're using on their plantations. But this is the really important key here. The debate over the tariffs is not really a debate over tariffs. And don't take my word for it. John C. Calhoun himself wrote in the 1820s that the tariffs were, quote, the occasion rather than the real cause of the present unhappy state of things, end quote. Now, what did he mean by that? Well, last week, we were talking a bit about how Southern politicians, especially those from South Carolina, were really trying to push for the strength of the federal government to defend slavery, especially through things like the Fugitive Slave Act, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and so forth. But those same politicians a generation later also recognize that in the long run, they need to find ways to limit the power of the federal government lest it decide to take a strong and strenuous anti-slavery stance. And so with the nullification theory, Calhoun's idea is we have to find a stopgap, a safety valve to make sure that the federal government never oversteps its bounds when it comes to defending and protecting the institution of slavery. And as we discussed last class, by the 1820s, slavery is at the heart of everything being done, not just in South Carolina, but throughout the American South. And so no matter what political party you're in, no matter what you believe in otherwise, if you are a Southern politician, above all else, you believe in the importance of slavery and defending that particular institution. Nullification theory is just one tool in the toolbox to do so with. And in fact, by 1832, the debates over the tariffs of 1824 and 28 become so strenuous within the federal government and in South Carolina that Vice President Calhoun actually steps down from the vice presidency to resume his role as a senator from South Carolina. Again, he literally gives up power in the federal government to resume representing the best interest of South Carolina. The problem for Calhoun, however, is that his adversary in this debate is Andrew Jackson. It is, I like to say, the Freddie versus Jason of American history debates, or for the movie coming out this weekend, Godzilla versus Kong. Where Andrew Jackson is, again, remembered to history as being an adversary of the indigenous people, especially Cherokee Nation, remembered as a slave owner, and also seen as the president of the common man, in this case, common white men across the country. Jackson was also a big believer in the primacy of the federal government over the individual states. And so when John C. Calhoun in South Carolina actually threatened to not enforce the tariffs at the port of Charleston, President Jackson says, that is fine. You don't have to enforce the tariff. I'll do it for you by sending in the US Army. And so as the US Army begins to mass on the border of South Carolina, South Carolinians decide to relent and to give up their fight against the tariff, recognizing, and this is important for 1860, that while they were willing to go as far as potential secession, the rest of the South was not. No other Southern state would support South Carolina during the nullification crisis of 1832. Again, you have to think about how much of an outlier South Carolina was when the rest of the South is saying, you guys are on your own. You can do this tariff thing if you wish, but we're not going to help. One of the key questions for tonight's class is, what changes between 1832 to 1860? We'll get into that in a moment. So really what you're seeing throughout the 19th century, and this is, of course, indicative of Western thought throughout the era of slavery, is that there are different theories being promoted about why slavery works, why slavery is justified. Often, most historians will point out that in the 18th century, folks like Thomas Jefferson, when they wrote about slavery, they wrote about it more as an accidental fact of life, as though the enslaved just showed up from thin air and just happened to be there to be used by white Americans. You actually see in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, many others, almost an apologetic sense of, well, we have slavery. It's just part of our way of life here in Virginia and elsewhere. It's unfortunate, but as we say now in the 21st century, it is what it is. By the 1830s, that's no longer the case. White Southerners are actively supporting slavery, and they're also saying it's actually a good thing, both for the white South and for the enslaved themselves. Enter into this debate South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond, who promotes what he refers to as the mudsill theory. The mudsill theory. Now, this is, the more I look at this theory, the more I realize that in some ways this is a precursor to fascism, if you really think about it. Because what Hammond's thought process basically is that the mudsill, right? That the mudsill is the base on which you build a structure like a house or what have you, but you have to have a base on which to build it. Hammond's argument is that slavery is the base upon which a modern, wealthy civilization should and can be built upon. And he's saying that the American South needs slavery as its mudsill on which to build a vibrant economy and a civilized way of life. They've gone beyond saying slavery is as Thomas Jefferson would have put it, a necessary evil. And it's more of this is actually good. This is an intrinsic good for the South. It frees up white Southerners to do other things, to build universities, to create cities, to create art and literature. And Hammond and others also argue this is good for Africans as well, because in their estimation, Africans were built to be enslaved. The argument was, well, just look at their bodies, look at the way they act, look at what they do for a living. They were meant to be enslaved. And if you try to argue with Hammond, as many abolitionists did, Hammond would argue, he would counter by saying, well, you might not like slavery, but as white Americans, we are we're trying to build the United States based on the precepts of ancient Roman Greece. There were plenty of enslaved people in ancient Roman Greece. If it was good enough for them, Hammond would have argued, it is certainly good enough for us. And in the 19th century, there were plenty of other nations that still practiced slavery as well. So the South is becoming more and more focused on not only, on the one hand, expanding slavery, but on the other hand, providing ideological motivation for defending that institution as well. Saying quite simply, there are some human beings who are fit to rule, and there are others who are fit to be ruled. I'm sorry, the more I teach this, the more it sounds like fascism. I'm that serious, because I teach this in my classes every year at Claflin, for instance. But it wasn't until now where I thought, well, this is, you change a couple of words here. This is very much justification for fascism, for Nazism, for a wide variety of totalitarian systems in the 20th century. Speaking of resistance to those systems, I do want to spend some time this evening talking about the growing abolitionist movement. And I think for students of the Modjeska Simkins School, this is an especially valuable lesson, because the abolitionists were very much the precursors of civil and human rights activists in the 20th century. the folks fighting for environmental protections today in the here and now. Every movement you can think of today that is a movement dedicated to justice, peace, and freedom has its precursor in the abolitionist movement. That's a good thing in the sense that the abolitionists provided a moral clarity, historically speaking, but it's also worth noting that the abolitionists were almost always in the minority, even in the North. But let's put the North aside for a second. Talk about these two women, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were actually from South Carolina and were from a well-to-do slaveholding family in South Carolina. As difficult as it was to be an abolitionist in, say, Ohio or New York or elsewhere in the North, difficulties that we would encounter being an outspoken abolitionist in the South. These difficulties were so great, in fact, that the Grimke sisters had to flee north in order to continue their abolitionist work. Abolitionism as a way of life, as a way of looking at the world, was thoroughly reviled throughout the South. So much so that the writings of the Grimke sisters and others were often intercepted and burned by post offices in South Carolina. If you were sending abolitionist pamphlets or tracts through the mail in the 1830s in South Carolina, such pamphlets were quickly intercepted and destroyed. They wanted no part of abolitionist ideology. And in fact, one of your readings for this week actually points out how the anti-abolitionist movement in the South was deeply committed to not only opposing abolition, but to also tying abolition to other progressive and left-wing movements of the 19th century. For example, I think if you did the readings for this week, you came across Louisa McCord, who was, well, you have the Grimke sisters as abolition activists. Louisa McCord was very much their opposites on the anti-abolitionist side. But funny enough, she also, McCord that is, tended to argue that abolitionism was nothing more than a form of left-wing socialist thought. Let's sit with that for a second. Someone from South Carolina saying a movement for freedom and justice has to be socialist in nature. We want to start a tradition of thought. That's kind of where it begins in the 19th century. But all jokes aside, McCord's comments about abolitionism and communism are actually worth putting in context, because the mid-19th century in European history is also an era of revolution. Most notably the revolutions of 1848, where there are attempts to create democratic governments in France, Germany, Italy, throughout the continent, that by 1849 have been thoroughly crushed. Many of those revolutionaries, especially from Germany, end up fleeing to the United States. That'll be very important when we get to the Civil War. But again, the mid-19th century is an era of not only abolitionism, but deep need reactionary thought throughout the Western world, to abolitionism, to ideas of liberal democracy, and obviously to ideas of socialism as well. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Can I rave a little bit about Louisa?
Sure, go right ahead.
I was stunned to find about Louisa in a reading that we use. It's in your study guide from Jacobin, which is a very, very socialist publication. And it just mentioned her. And so I went down the rabbit hole a few years ago. The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. By 1850, she's a national known figure running this line that abolition was socialism. And I had no idea that was happening then, nor did I know that Louisa was not only in Columbia. The house that she lived in is across the street, the corner of Bull and Pendleton. that is across the street from the administration horseshoe. And that, that she is lifted up in South Carolina history books and things we read, the ETV and whatnot, of being a great writer and poet. And her friend was Mary Chestnut, who was also someone in that era that wrote a lot about the glory of the Old South. But Louisa was really something in terms of being in the swim with people like Calhoun and Jefferson and et cetera, but really unusual woman who was really outspoken and basically wrong in everything that we teach here. But I would encourage you to go back if you missed that part in your study guide, because it's something that you can amaze your friends with.
Well, and I think the thing about Louisa McCord is I got to give her credit because she also in many ways is the predecessor of right-wing grifting. But I think also, though, when we think about the politics of the mid to late 19th century, we think that they're so far away from our time period. But I'll give you an example, and we'll talk about more Reconstruction. When Reconstruction is going on across the South in the 1870s, one of the things that conservative journalists compare it to is the Paris Commune going on in France in 1871. They're saying that the tumult of Reconstruction is as bad as the revolution in France, right? Again, comparing, say, socialists and other left-wingers in France to the kind of tumult and frankly revolutionary upheaval you were seeing in the South at that same time. Before you get to the idea of outside agitators in the 20th century, you're already seeing in the 19th century that those on the conservative end of the spectrum already tying together these various movements for social justice and freedom.
Her father was Speaker of the House of the United States of America in the 1820s from Charleston. So she was running in some high cotton.
Right.
That house is now owned by Henry McMaster.
That is what I hear.
Oh,
I think that he's unloaded it recently. I looked just recently, but he owns a lot of property.
I'm just going to leave the jokes behind. But I guess that also shows that it's a small world when it comes to the politics of South Carolina. I digress. So the abolitionist movement by the 1830s has created several large-scale organizations, the biggest one being the American Anti-Slavery Society, formed in 1833 by prominent abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappert. By 1838, just 5 years later, they had over 200,000 members, which is pretty significant for the United States at that time. But there are two things to keep in mind. Number one, they had virtually zero presence in the South for obvious reasons. They can't even get anything mailed down, much less organized groups. But secondly, the American Anti-Slavery Society also faced considerable opposition in the North as well. Many white Northerners were opposed to them, not because of having any sort of great warm feelings for slavery, but they were concerned about Black competition, economically speaking. One of the big fears across the North in the early to mid 19th century was, if slavery ended tomorrow, where are the enslaved going to go? They're going to come north and they're going to take our jobs. This was a major fear in the North at that time, but I don't want to downplay the anti-Black racism of the North at that time either. For example, in the late 1840s, Frederick Douglass, when he gets involved in the movement, is involved in a 100 conventions movement. It's an attempt to create various chapters of the Anti-Slavery Society across the North. For his troubles, Douglass is actually attacked in Ohio and has I think his right wrist broken in the process. Being part of the American Anti-Slavery Society was dangerous. In 1830s and 1840s and 1850s America, politics was not just about the ballot box or public speeches. Sometimes it also meant being willing to defend yourself after giving a speech against a vicious mob, which happened many times when abolitionists gave anti-slavery talks. And there are, of course, other forms of resistance. This is really the time period, the mid-19th century, when you see the Underground Railroad becoming a more formalized system of getting enslaved out of the South and to freedom. Now, to be a conductor on this Underground Railroad meant two things. You had to be willing to take an enslaved person and their family into your home and hide them. And secondly, you had to be willing to break the law to do so. Because remember, if you're helping an enslaved person escape to freedom, you're not only breaking federal law, you are circumventing the US Constitution. Fugitive slave clause made it quite clear. If you are aware of an enslaved person in your vicinity, in your purview, you're supposed to help their slave owner get that person back. Otherwise, you are, for all intents and purposes, stealing property and hurting that slaveholder in the process. And so when you see maps like this, let's take a look at this for a second and look at the routes they're taking. For example, if you're emerging out of South Carolina, let's say you're leaving Columbia, Orangeburg, your most likely route is either to go up the coast into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and perhaps escape to Canada, or you might try to make it to Charleston, perhaps forge some papers, present yourself as a sailor, and then sail up the Atlantic seaboard, freedom in Philadelphia, New York, or Boston. If you're coming out of the Delta region, Mississippi Delta region, you're going up Mississippi River and trying to escape to the Midwest. And I hate when the map is cut off here, but if you're in Texas, going north is a bit of a challenge. So just go to Mexico. Keep in mind that Mexico ended slavery long before the United States did. In fact, this was one of the key reasons why Texas fought for its independence in the 1830s. If you remember the Alamo, you are remembering saving slavery in Texas. And that brings me back to US foreign policy for a second. By the 1840s, it was becoming quite clear to many politicians across the country that slavery was becoming the central issue that no one wanted to talk about. Unlike in our more civilized age today, where all political issues are solved peacefully, in the mid-1840s, there was deep concern about the debate over slavery would look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Now, I want to bring your attention really quickly to Texas over here. Again, I mentioned how when Texas first sought its independence in 1836, it was in large part because many of the white Americans who moved there were trying to preserve slavery. The nation of Mexico had already taken steps to abolish slavery in its territory. And funny enough, if you're thinking to yourself, well, why are there white Americans in Texas, or as it was called at the time, Tejas, in the first place? It was because Mexico was encouraging immigration from the United States into Mexico. Because Tejas, the territory here, was sparsely populated. There were mostly Comanche Indians there and only a smattering of Spanish-speaking Mexicans, and that was it. They were hoping to encourage white Americans to move there. And the idea was, we'll let them move there. And if they move to Tejas, the deal will be they will convert to Catholicism, they will learn Spanish, and they will eventually give up their slaves. Instead, they kept speaking English, they remained Protestant, and they brought more slaves with them. This would lead to Texas declaring independence in 1836. And for 9 years, it became the Lone Star Republic, an independent nation that was struggling to survive, in part because while Mexico did initially surrender, they never really recognized Texas as an independent state. Meanwhile, in the East, the United States is having a long-running debate about annexing Texas. Now, if you go back to your Constitution for a second, the Constitution says a lot of things about a lot of different topics. But if you read it all the way through, there's nothing in there about the annexation of territory. And so there were some in the US Senate who argued are we even sure we have the right to annex territory like this? Because again, Texas was an independent nation. Others were opposed to it for one very simple reason. They could look at a map and they knew if Texas was absorbed into the Union, it would quickly become a slave state. It would be a slave state from day one. Now, by the 1840s, Congress had tried to punt the question of slavery down the road via the Missouri Compromise, where in 1820, it was agreed that any state that came south of roughly this parallel line or so would be a slave state, and anything north of that to be a free state. There was a constant concern about the balance in the Senate, in particular, between slave and free states. And folks knew that if Texas was added to the Union, it could upset that balance. Oh, there's one other small thing I forgot to mention. Mexico told the US government, by the way, if you annex Texas, we will consider that an act of war against the nation of Mexico. The Americans in 1845 decide to annex Texas anyway. And one of the reasons they're able to do so that particular year is because John C. Calhoun is briefly made Secretary of State just to complete the deal to annex Texas and bring it into the Union. Mexico is outraged. The following year, the federal government of the United States sends US troops to the border between Texas and Mexico. There's one small problem. The two nations do not agree on where that border actually is. Of course, today the border is the Rio Grande River, which the US believed was the border at that time. Mexico said, no, it's actually the Nueces River about 100 miles north of it. American troops went between those two rivers, planted the American flag, and basically encouraged the Mexican army to attack them in territory that was disputed. When word reaches the capital in Washington, D.C. of this attack on the US troops, Congress is galvanized into declaring war on Mexico. Not everyone, however, agreed with this, because there was some question about where US troops were attacked, what they were doing there in the first place. And some in Congress even said, we basically provoked the War of Mexico to expand slavery. Yes.
It's Travis that has the monument on the State House grounds about organizing a South Carolina contingent to go to Texas. And one of the interesting ironies of the border is that at the time of the 1840s and this business about who owned Texas, Mexico was an anti-slave state. There were people from South Carolina that had gone to Texas to prevent people from crossing the border the other way they're doing now.
Well, there you go. I mean, again, this is one of the great ironies of history.
The monument making it over State House grounds.
Right. And, you know, again, during the Mexican War, you also have the formation of the Palmetto Regiment, which is an all-volunteer force in South Carolina that was sent to fight in the Mexican War. Now, one of the things about the War of Mexico that's worth noting is that the war had tremendous support in the Deep South. Southern politicians all voted in favor of it. They voted war funds for it. They, again, formed regiments. If you follow college sports, the University of Tennessee is known for volunteers. That nickname comes from the Mexican War. But that's in the South. When we think about anti-war opposition to American wars, we tend to think primarily of Vietnam, and with good reason. But Mexico, the War of Mexico, sparks a lot of anti-war opposition throughout the country, especially in the Northeast. I want to read you a few quotes here from abolitionists. For example, Ralph Waldo Emerson, famed abolitionist and writer in the 19th century, said, quote, "The United States will conquer Mexico but it will be as a man who swallowed the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us, end quote. Now, what Emerson is saying here, and what he's warning about, is that if America went its war with Mexico, which it did, it would acquire all this territory, which would become wrapped up in the debate over slave or free territory. It's going to force a final and decisive reckoning with the institution of slavery, whether folks want to admit this or not. Now that's Emerson talking about the war. Ulysses S. Grant, who will become prominent during our Reconstruction lecture, also later on this evening with the Civil War section of our lecture, when he wrote his memoirs in the 1880s, he looked back on his time serving in the U.S. Army during the Mexican War. And most of the Civil War generals we know, Grant, Lee, so on and so forth, they all fought in Mexico. But he wrote this, and I think this is extraordinary. Quote, "The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times," end quote. Basically saying that our going to war with Mexico on false pretenses was punished by the American Civil War. And there are many of the Americans who felt the same way by the end of the 1870s and 80s, that the carnage of the Civil War was kind of what we deserved for what we did to Mexico, like 10 years before that. Frederick Douglass was also an outspoken critic of the Mexican War, criticizing and excoriating the abolitionist movement for not doing more to oppose the war, seeing that the abolitionists had been ineffective in stopping the war in the first place. And as the war went on, failing to convince the country to stop the war while I had a chance to do so. Even John C. Calhoun, who looks like the bad guy in a horror movie here in this photograph, recognized what was coming down the pipeline. He said, quote, "The day of retribution will come, and when it does, awful will be the reckoning, and heavy the responsibilities somewhere." And then he dies in 1850, so he doesn't see what happens after that. But even Calhoun is saying, you know, maybe this war we fought wasn't a good idea after all. Oh well. I put this into the lecture because I think the War of Mexico is one of those conflicts that most Americans have either forgotten about, or if they learned about it, it's like, oh, we won the war against Mexico, got all this territory, and that's it. But in the 19th century, it was one of those conflicts that, for most white Americans, became a moral challenge because they felt that the war was fought under false pretenses. For example, during the war, as the war is going on, a congressman in the Whig Party actually proposes what's called the spot resolution in Congress, where he asked President James K. Polk to point on a map where the Americans were attacked in 1846. By the way, that congressman was Abraham Lincoln, who was also opposed to the Mexican War, but like most of his brethren in Congress, voted in favor of funding the war to continue it on into 1847, 1848. But Calhoun was right, which I will never say again in this class. Quickly after the war ended and Mexico surrendered, the question was raised of what to do with territory taken from Mexico during the war. Originally, the war was fought to take Texas and to preserve Texas within the Union. But what would happen, let me go back a few slides, is that the United States would acquire all of this territory in the orange, right? They would purchase some territory from Mexico in the 1853 Gadsden Purchase, but the states of California, Utah, so on and so forth, they were acquired thanks to the war in 1848. Around that same time, the United States was also able to acquire territory via treaty from Great Britain, which is now the Pacific Northwest. And so by the end of the 1840s, the United States does stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. But the question becomes what to do with all this territory out west. Some of it, like Texas, of course, will become slave states. But then there's the rest of it. What's going to happen to what is, for example, California, which goes from being a territory to a state in a very, very short amount of time, thanks to the 1849 California Gold Rush. Fun fact, California almost became a slave state because many white Southerners actually moved to that state during the Gold Rush. And even during the Civil War, there were some Confederate sympathies within California itself. But the idea of figuring out a compromise to this issue, of trying to find a way to keep an equal balance of free states and slave states, free territory and slave territory, would vex the minds of American politicians throughout the 1850s. For example, this cartoon right here portrays how more and more Northern white Americans felt about the debate over slavery. It shows basically a farmer being forced to swallow an enslaved African. It says here, murder, help neighbors help, oh my poor wife and children, showing how most white Northerners felt that they were being forced to support slavery with these various compromises and so forth in Congress. But if you look right over here, this is where things get kind of interesting. You might not be able to see it from where you're sitting in the classroom, but you see Kansas right here, right? Kansas, when it was brought in as a territory, it was initially brought in under the idea of popular sovereignty, where the people who lived there would be able to vote on whether they would be a slave or free territory. The idea was this was the most democratic, small d democratic idea out there. It couldn't possibly backfire. Instead, it turns into an outright disaster when Kansas becomes known to the country as Bleeding Kansas, where abolitionists and slaveholders alike are moving to the state not only to vote, but eventually to actually start killing each other in guerrilla warfare. This is where John Brown first becomes, to some, a hero and to others a terrorist. It was in Bleeding Kansas. But in this cartoon, you see Kansas in the light here, but in the shadows, you see Cuba and Central America. This is because Southern politicians have already begun talking about how can we acquire still more territory to add to the United States for the purpose of slavery. They already have their eyes set on the Caribbean and Central America as places where they could overthrow governments, they could perhaps purchase territory, make them into states. A key aim of many Southern politicians was an aggressive US foreign policy that would mean the acquisition of territory in the Caribbean and Latin America, whether through treaty, through purchasing, or, if necessary, through armed force. So again, the debate over slavery wasn't just a debate about what was happening internally within the United States. It was increasingly turning into a debate about US foreign policy as well. And as we mentioned in the last week's study guide, there is a great book by Matt Karp called This Vast, I forget the exact title, but it's a book about how slavery heavily influenced US foreign policy throughout the first years of the 19th century. But these compromises aren't working. And again, I'm kind of speeding through this because in the long run, the compromises would lead to civil war. There was no way to avoid it in the 1850s. Things become so bad, in fact, that by 1856, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina, outraged that Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had spoken ill of one of his relatives in Congress, Preston Brooks actually beat Charles Sumner senseless on the floor of the Senate. I'm not joking, with an actual cane. The beating was so bad that Sumner was out of the Senate for almost 2 years. And in the North, again, this cartoon is from the North. It says Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs. In the South, Preston Brooks was a regional hero. Hundreds, if not thousands, of canes were mailed to Preston Brooks' congressional office in Washington, D.C., as a show of support for what he did to Charles Sumner. Oh, by the way, Congress in the 19th century was one of the most dangerous places to be in the country. No, I'm dead serious. There were fist fights on the floor of Congress every year. Congressmen brought knives, sometimes pistols, to the floor of the House and the Senate. It certainly makes C-SPAN a lot more interesting today if that were the case. But I kid. Actually, that'd be pretty nasty. By 1857, both the presidential and congressional branches of the government had failed to solve the issue of slavery. Whether it was the idea of popular sovereignty, compromise lines, etc., it was unclear how the slavery issue would be solved. And so this meant the Supreme Court had its chance to be in the sun and to make a difference. Dred and Harriet Scott would sue for their freedom in what was then the Free Territory of Wisconsin. They had been brought there by their slave owner in the 1840s, and abolitionists in Wisconsin convinced them to go to a local court and sue for their freedom. After all, they were in a free territory of the United States. According to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that area was supposed to be free of slavery. No slavery was allowed. If you were an enslaved person there, technically you're supposed to be free. So the Scots take their case to court, and eventually by 1857, it makes its way to the Supreme Court. Now, the case known to history as Dred Scott v. Sandford was originally only supposed to deal with Dred and Harriet Scott, and to an extent, slavery in free territories. But Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a slaveholder himself from Maryland, felt that this was the Supreme Court's best chance yet to solve the issue of slavery for the entire country. And so not only is there a ruling about slavery, the Dred Scott v. Sandford decision becomes a ruling about the status of Black people in America in general. For one, Chief Justice Taney and the majority of the Supreme Court argued that actually the Congress of the United States overstepped its bounds in creating free territory. That if the enslaved are property, you should be able to take your property anywhere in the country without fear of losing. Very quickly, folks in the North realized they're saying the entire country is slave territory. Whether you're in South Carolina or Massachusetts, Minnesota or Texas, everywhere, technically, the enslaved should be enslaved. But they go a step further than that, where Taney basically argues that if you are a free Black person, a free African American, you have, in his words, no rights which the white man is bound to respect. In other words, if you are Black in America, you cannot possibly be a citizen of the country. You cannot. This is a white man's country. This country was not made for you. If you look at the Constitution before the Civil War, there is nothing in the Constitution that specifically states the requirements for citizenship. And in the early to mid 19th century, there were numerous Black activists, many of whom were abolitionists, who were also thinking about, well, if we can destroy slavery, what does that mean about the rights of Black people to be citizens? because they understood in a way even most of their white allies did not, that the fight against slavery and oppression did not end with the end of slavery. That was merely the beginning point. But things after the Dred Scott decision seemed pretty dire for the abolitionist movement. For many abolitionists, it was seen as a major blow, except for Frederick Douglass, who argued that the Scott decision actually crystallized everything. It made clear what the fight against slavery was going to take. And for some, like John Brown, what the Dred Scott decision said was, you know what? The time for moral suasion, speeches and speech making, pamphlets and book writing and petitions and all of this, that time is over. It's probably time to start arming slaves. Now, before John Brown and his men launched their raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, Brown approaches two individuals to see if they'll help with this fight. For one, he approaches Frederick Douglass. He asks Douglass for help. And Douglass respects John Brown's moxie. He likes the idea in theory, but Douglass is also very skeptical. Tells Brown, I'm not sure if you have enough men or supplies. You're talking about going into Virginia, raiding an armory and giving arms to enslaved Africans. There are a lot of moving parts here. I'm not so sure this will work. And so Douglass regretfully turns him down. Harriet Tubman does not. Now, Harriet Tubman by this point had for years not only been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but she had taken hundreds of enslaved Africans to freedom in the North through various means and methods. And she was down to help John Brown with this raid. She was like, yes, I am on board with this 100%. You can count on me. Unfortunately, she became ill shortly before the raid and couldn't be there. And there are some historians who argue that made a big difference. Where John Brown had some experience fighting in Kansas against slaveholders, Harriet Tubman had a unique understanding of how to use terrain. Again, remember, she's on the Underground Railroad taking folks up through the South to the North to freedom. And she's not there at the raid, and the Harper's Ferry raid in 1859 is initially a failure. Brown and his men are trapped in an arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They are assaulted by a platoon of U.S. Marines led by a Colonel Robert E. Lee. We'll talk about more in a second. And they are forced to surrender. Now, Virginia captures John Brown and his men to put him on trial, which was a mistake because they gave John Brown the greatest opportunity of his life to speak out against slavery. And they recorded what John Brown said at his trial when he knew he was going to be executed and how he warned Virginia and the entire country that the issue of slavery would only be solved by blood. Furthermore, his execution in Virginia sparked two different reactions. Across the South, John Brown again was seen as a terrorist, as someone who deserved death. But many white Southerners were stunned when in the North, John Brown was seen as a hero all across North, even in places that were not abolitionist strongholds. Because by 1859, many white Northerners, regardless of what they felt about Black people personally, had begun to believe that slavery and the institution of slavery had become too powerful in American life. Not just because of the compromises, but because of the Dred Scott decision. There were people in the North who argued that the Dred Scott decision proved that the government of the United States was a slaveocracy. It was for the slaveholders, by the slaveholders, of the slaveholders. And by 1860, across the North, again, amongst white Northerners, there was an increasing sense that something had to be done to stop the slaveocracy. This would explain why the Republican Party comes to existence in 1854. Now, the Republican Party of the 1850s was formed by abolitionists, anti-slavery advocates, members of the Whig Party, even some disaffected Democrats who were all tired of the power of slavery in the country. And within 6 years, they win the presidency, albeit with only about 40% of the popular vote. When Abraham Lincoln runs for president in 1860, Southerners fear that the Republican Party is going to abolish slavery as soon as they enter the White House, despite the fact that Abraham Lincoln himself repeatedly said, no, we are not trying to destroy slavery where it already is. We are simply trying to stop slavery from spreading further westward. To the South, that was one and the same. After all, as I mentioned before, slaveholders knew for slavery to keep going, to stay economically profitable, they had to acquire more territory sooner or later. If you prevent the spread of slavery westward, what you're doing is cutting off an avenue for slavery to grow. And eventually that might kill slavery itself. Now, this map also shows us the importance of political mobilization and political organizing. The Democratic Party, part of its age-old tradition, broke into several different parts at its national convention that was held initially in Charleston, South Carolina. Eventually, there are two men running for the Democratic Party, John Breckinridge and Stephen F. Douglas. There's a Constitutional Union Party, John Bell. The Constitutional Unionists are basically the no labels party of their time period. They were, I'm serious, they were running basically, they were saying, we're going to defend the Constitution. How? We don't know, we're just doing that. Republicans, Lincoln is not even on the ballot in the South, and he still wins. This is the thing that Southern politicians have been afraid of for several generations, that there would be a purportedly anti-slavery candidate who could unite the South and win a national election. No longer was the 3/5 compromise enough to keep the South in power. Instead, the North got behind an anti-slavery candidate, at least a candidate opposed to slavery spreading westward, and voted for it. Also, in 1860, I cannot help but note this with our current debates. Some of Abraham Lincoln's most ardent supporters in the Republican Party were known as the Wide Awakes. I'm not making that up. They were the Wide Awakes. They would actually, during the convention in Chicago in 1860, they actually marched in the middle of the night down the street, holding up lanterns, and they called themselves the Wide Awakes. They would have these big rallies in cities across the North where they spoke out against slavery, spoke in favor of the Republican Party, and so forth, and they called themselves the Wide Awakes. I'm going to spare you the jokes about woke and that terminology. But again, the Republican Party in 1860 represented, amongst white Americans in the North, a deep frustration with the institution of slavery. Now, soon after the election is over in the winter of 1860, South Carolina, as usual, is a big concern about the direction of the country. And they hold a quick convention where they decide to secede from the Union. Now, I mentioned that in 1832, when they threatened to secede, no one else in the South follows them. In 1850, there is talk of secession across the South. And they even hold a secession convention in Nashville, where they decide to postpone it because of the compromise of 1850. Compromise was reached on slavery in territories out west, and they said, okay, we can stop talking about secession. But now in 1860, the talk is coming up again. And this time, South Carolina is ready. They send representatives from their state throughout the South to speak at other secession conventions, to convince folks that secession is the best idea, especially in the face of Abraham Lincoln and this insurgent Republican Party. Now, why does South Carolina and the other southern states secede from the Union? This is one of those questions that is important to American history and is intrinsic in our understanding of the American past. I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to actually show you instead. And this is a big gob of words on the page here. But this is actually taken from South Carolina's Ordinance of Secession in December of 1860. I'll just read it out loud. The general government, as the common agent, passed laws to carry into effect these stipulations of the states. The stipulations here refer to protecting slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act and clause of the Constitution. For many years, these laws were executed, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa have enacted laws which either nullify the acts of Congress or render useless any attempt to execute them. And this is, again, this is a real thing. By the late 1850s, not only have cities and states saying they will not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act or the Fugitive Slave Clause, they even gone so far as having abolitionists outright block U.S. Marshals from trying to enforce the laws in places like Boston and Philadelphia, for instance. There's one story, even Frederick Douglass, when he's giving a speech in the 1840s, they actually hear that there are U.S. Marshals coming to their church to arrest Douglass. The abolitionists block the Marshals at the front door, and Douglass escapes out the back door, eventually ending up in Great Britain for several years. In many of these states, the fugitive is discharged from service or labor claim, and in none of them has the state government complied with the stipulation made in the Constitution. The state of New Jersey, I think I actually just lost. Sorry, guys. I have to check on something. I think I just got bumped out of the Zoom link. Give me just 1 second, please. Let me get back to that. Oh, I see what happened. So for whatever reason, my Wi-Fi signal stopped working. Okay, let me connect again. Okay, it's connecting now. Just 1 second. But I think you can kind of see what my point is here, is that what South Carolina is saying is that the northern states are simply not abiding by the Constitution. They're not enforcing slavery as they're supposed to. And so South Carolina decides to go ahead and secede from the Union. Now, the question we should be asking ourselves is, well, that's South Carolina. What about the rest of the South? Each southern state wrote an ordinance of secession explaining why they leave the Union. Some states say they're just leaving and that's it. But states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and others explicitly say they are leaving because they feel that slavery is under threat, it's under attack. And for the folks on Zoom, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. I do apologize for that brief interruption. Let me get back on Zoom in just 1 second. But I also always tell my students this. We talk about why does the South secede from the Union? We should also be asking ourselves the question, why does the North fight so hard to keep them in the Union? Right, a big part of this was frustration with the slaveocracy, but as President Lincoln and other Republican leaders point out in the 1860s, if states are going to leave the Union just because their candidate for president doesn't win, that is going to be a very ineffective system of government. And states cannot just simply leave the union because they feel like it, because the wrong guy won election, right? So this becomes a big part of Republican Party policy as well, to be deeply opposed to secession. Also, Lincoln points out, the Constitution doesn't say anything about secession being legal. So these are all seen, both slaveocracy and secession are both seen as considerable threats to the Constitution. That if you cannot have a national election with the threat of secession or rebellion, then democracy is basically doomed. Now, I am going to blame the spirit of John C. Calhoun for interrupting my Wi-Fi there as I'm making that point. Somebody doesn't want to talk about the Civil War as it actually was. Actually, I'll blame the Sims history I have here. Maybe this book is, maybe it has some like evil spirits in it, who knows? Okay, so by early 1861, 7 states have left the Union. President Lincoln, who becomes president in March of 1861, is trying to keep the remaining southern states in the Union, most notably Virginia. Virginia is the big one. It is still a really important state, politically speaking. The hope is they can keep Virginia in the Union. Maybe this won't be so bad. But Lincoln has a problem. By March of 1861, most federal forts and installations in the South have basically surrendered to this new Confederate States of America, except for one, Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The new Confederate government, which, by the way, Abraham Lincoln never formally recognizes, is saying that we want Fort Sumter or we'll attack it. President Lincoln doesn't want that to happen, but he also cannot give up Fort Sumter without a fight. And so what he decides to do is to go ahead and rearm and resupply Fort Sumter and to force the Confederates to fire the first shot. They do, sparking the Civil War. Despite that, several more upper South states, including Virginia, decide to join the Confederacy after President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Now, the war, of course, is the bloodiest war in US history, but I want to focus on South Carolina in particular. We believe that up to 60,000 South Carolinians fight in the war, which is a staggering number for such a small state at that time. Only about 791 South Carolinians seek exemptions from military service during the war. South Carolina, putting aside what the war is about for a second, when we're talking about a state sending its young men off to fight in this war, South Carolina sends a staggering amount of men to do that. This is how much the state believes in the cause of the Confederacy. Now, early on in the war, the Confederacy writes its own constitution, which defends the institution of slavery. The vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, gives his cornerstone speech, where he says that the cornerstone of the Confederacy is slavery and white supremacy. He even goes so far in his speech as to condemn Thomas Jefferson, to say that Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and its idea that all men are created equal was wrong-headed. It was incorrect, and it's clear that that is not what the South is fighting for. The Confederacy is committed to defending slavery, no matter the cost. By November 1861, the federal government is launching probing attacks all along the borders of the Confederacy. One place where they are successful is Port Royal, South Carolina, where the federal Navy attacks Port Royal and is eventually able to place federal troops there. And what happens is slaveholders in Port Royal flee into the interior of South Carolina, leaving behind thousands of enslaved Africans, or in this case, formerly enslaved Africans. And this is, in case you wonder where Port Royal is, right near Beaufort, South Carolina. And when the federal troops arrive on the coastline, the first thing they have to confront is what to do with these thousands of formerly enslaved people. Now, as soon as the Civil War began in 1861, federal troops quickly began to see first a trickle and then an onrush of enslaved Africans fleeing to federal lines. Before North or South formally recognized and said the war was about slavery, the enslaved knew what the war was actually about. They were the ones who helped force federal policy to eventually become a policy of not only taking in the enslaved, but taking them in as a wartime measure. During the war's earliest months and years, federal policymakers in Washington, D.C., and Union generals alike recognized that the only advantage the South had over the North was their use of enslaved labor. The enslaved could be used to create fortifications, to create munitions, to free up Southern laborers to go off and fight on the front lines. But that's only part of the story of Port Royal. Port Royal also becomes a story of, well, let's say slavery is ended. What happens next? The enslaved on Port Royal, after their slaveholders fled to the countryside, quickly organized themselves into farming, into laboring. There was a question in the white North that if they were to end slavery, they felt that the Africans would be too lazy to work for themselves. They owned the workers for like 3 centuries at this point without any sort of compensation. Go figure. But at Port Royal, federal troops were surprised to see that the Africans were working, not only working for themselves, but that these same Africans were also yearning for an education. The folks at Port Royal really asked for 2 things. They asked for land and they asked for a chance at education. And so shortly after Port Royal fell to the federal forces, you start to see teachers from New England coming down to Port Royal to teach these people how to read and write. Among those teachers was Charlotte Fortin, who was a young Black woman from New England who had been educated quite well in New England, and she felt it was her duty to come down south and to help educate the enslaved. Now, initially when Miss Fortin came to Port Royal, she kind of assumed, like most other Northerners, that, oh, the enslaved are ignorant, they're backward. But what she found instead, like many of her counterparts, Black and white, was that the enslaved in Port Royal had their own rich culture. They had their own labor songs, sorrow songs. They had their own interpretations of the Bible. And above all, to the surprise of many, the enslaved actually had dreams for what their lives would be once they were free. The enslaved in Port Royal, the enslaved across the South, were often as politically sophisticated as anyone else in the country. Yes, they had been enslaved in body, but not in mind or in spirit. And this is what federal soldiers encountered at Port Royal in 1861 and 62. And this would help direct federal policy during Reconstruction. At Port Royal, the debate was simple. What the enslaved wanted, land, chance for an education, versus what white federal officials wanted for them, which was, sure, an education and some land, but they were also deeply committed to making sure that the formerly enslaved were thrust as quickly as possible into the system of capitalism as quickly as they could, to become part of the market system of economics. But the enslaved, or formerly enslaved, were much more interested in just being self-sufficient. Yeah, sure, selling some surplus crops in the market is fine, but they had their own ideas of what freedom looked like. So you can kind of see as early as 1861, the debates about Reconstruction are already started. And the formerly enslaved are going to be instrumental in those debates to come. Now, as the Civil War continues on, eventually Abraham Lincoln and the federal government will relent and allow over 200,000 Black men to serve in the federal Army and Navy. They constitute, by the end of the war, 10% of the federal government's fighting force. President Lincoln himself admits by the end of the war that without Black troops, the federal government does not win the American Civil War. One of the first units founded was the 1st South Carolina Volunteers that you see this painting here. Many of them were former slaves from South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and they are written about in the book Army Life in a Black Regiment, which was written by Thomas Hentworth Higginson at the end of the Civil War. It's an excellent book about how this abolitionist and Higginson serves in the federal army and works alongside Black soldiers and learns a lot from them. By the way, if you've ever seen the film Glory, Glory is about the 54th Massachusetts fights at Battle Fort Wagner. But earlier in the film, when they first come to South Carolina, you remember they meet some troops who were speaking Gullah. That's the 1st Volunteers, South Carolina. They were recognizable with their red trousers. South Carolina very quickly goes from being on the periphery of the Civil War to being at its heart. Of course, as I mentioned with the film Glory, Black troops under command of Robert Gould Shaw assault Battery Wagner on July 17, 1863. Despite the fact the attack is unsuccessful, it shows to white Northerners that Black troops will fight and fight very well, even in the face of Confederate resistance. Now, keep in mind, if you were a Black soldier fighting in the Civil War, you had some extra motivation to fight hard. Most of these soldiers had relatives, fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, wives, sisters, brothers, etc., who were still enslaved. Americans often like to say to ourselves about our history that all of our wars are wars of liberation. Now, that's not quite true. But if there's one war that fits that definition, at least for one side, is this one. And as the war years progress, in the South, support for the Confederacy wanes during the course of the war. Now remember, the Confederacy was a government, a regime built on enslaved labor. But there's a slight problem. That enslaved labor is being used to grow cotton, not food. By 1863, there are bread riots in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Across the South, especially in Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, there is considerable anti-Confederate opposition from white Southerners, many of whom in that part of the South are not slaveholders. They do not want to fight a war to protect slavery. If you've seen the film, The Free State of Jones, it gets into folks in Mississippi and elsewhere who are also resisting the Confederate war effort. Over 100,000 white Southerners fight for the Union. Let me say that again. Over 100,000 white Southerners fight not for the Confederacy, but for the Union. Kind of wonder where their statues are, State House ground, but I just putting that out there. By the way, it is worth noting though that the ones that you have white troops from every Southern state except one fighting for the Union, South Carolina. This is the only state that doesn't have any white troops in the federal government fighting against the Confederacy. You have actual entire regiments from Alabama, from Georgia, from Tennessee, from North Carolina, from Virginia, One of the federal government's best generals, George Thomas, is a Virginian. Where Robert E. Lee fights for the Confederacy, George Thomas fights for the Union. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that the white South is united on the issue of the Civil War. Far from it. There are many white Southerners who either oppose Confederacy directly or just don't support the war. In fact, by 1863-64, the Confederate Army has a severe desertion problem, where soldiers are literally just walking away from the front lines and walking back home. And the Confederacy, because it loves states' rights so much, passes laws that give the Confederate government the authority to basically surveil their own citizens, to arrest any deserters and to either make them prisoners or to send them back to the front lines. Ironically enough, one of the things they used to do this with are slave patrols, which are now targeting not only enslaved Africans, but also white deserters from the Confederate war effort. Slavery itself is under constant attack during the war. W.E.B. Du Bois writes about the Civil War as a general strike by the enslaved. During the war itself, out of an enslaved population of 4 million, over 500,000 enslaved Africans escaped to freedom in some form or fashion. One example of this is the Combahee River raid, which occurs right here in South Carolina, led by our good friend Harriet Tubman, where she actually leads federal troops into a raid on the Combahee River to free, I think, about a couple hundred enslaved Africans. And by the way, think about this for a second. We have women like Tubman actually doing work alongside the U.S. Army. This is like one of the first times in history that actually happens. But it's not really until early 1865 where the war really comes to the Palmetto State. Now, I'm from Georgia. And growing up in Georgia in the mid-1990s, when we learn about Sherman's March to the Sea, it was always a big deal. It's like, General William T. Sherman, that SOB, he burned the state down. And even as a kid, I'm thinking to myself, is that a bad thing? I mean, think about what they were fighting for. And, my folks, my dad's side of the family is from Greene County, Georgia. My mother's side is from Augusta, Georgia, and Greenville, South Carolina. So I like to think that some of my ancestors were pretty pleased with General Sherman in 1864, 65. But that March to the Sea in 1864 leads Sherman to Savannah. And they decide to camp there for Christmas. There's a joke of General Sherman telegraphing Abraham Lincoln, "I present to you, sir, the city of Savannah." Now, there have been debates for generations amongst historians about how much of the damage on the March to the Sea was caused by Sherman versus the Confederate Army fleeing from Sherman's march. Still kind of up in the air about that. But what we do know is that when Sherman's army had a chance to go into South Carolina in 1865, everything we know about the army at that time shows they were very eager to dish out some punishment to South Carolina, because the North blamed South Carolina for the war. Remember, they were the first state to secede. They were the state of John C. Calhoun, of James Henry Hammond, a hotbed of slavery and secessionist thought and nullification ideology. Many federal troops basically said, we enter South Carolina, we're going to have some fun. And very quickly, they have plenty of fun. Columbia falls on February 17th, 1865. Again, there are arguments about who set fire to what in Columbia, but the city earned its moniker famously hot on that particular day. I'm sorry, I had to make that joke. And of course, we have actual photographic evidence of the destruction of Columbia as well. And this is actually this is what Columbia looks like. Next lecture, I'll show some images of Charleston as well, which was also in ruins at this time. But I want to end with this image instead. This is an artist's rendering. I'll just read the bottom. You can't see the caption where you are, but the caption says, this is from Harper's Weekly, March 18th, 1865. So a handful of weeks before General Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Marching on, the 55th Massachusetts Colored Regiment singing John Brown's March in the streets of Charleston, February 21st, 1865. This is quite literally an army of liberation taking Charleston, South Carolina. And you look at the image, right? You look at the soldiers. They're all Black soldiers of Massachusetts. And look who's greeting them, the formerly enslaved. Now, we have this image of the Civil War as a war of brother against brother, of North versus South, of blue versus gray, of Union versus Confederate. But when we do that, when we describe the war in that fashion, we forget the fact that the Federal Army quite literally saved millions of people from slavery. Some of them saved themselves. Again, 500,000 fled slavery. Some fled into Congaree Swamp. Others fled to Union lines. Some of them ended up fighting for the Union Army. Some of them were in this group. And again, you have this in Charleston in April 1st or 2nd of 1865. The first troops to enter Richmond, Virginia were Black soldiers who were greeted by two groups of people, silent white Southerners who were stunned by what they saw, and formerly enslaved Africans who greeted them as liberators. Now, I want to end today's session with friend of the class, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois, of course, was an astute student of history. And in 1928, he wrote an essay simply titled Robert E. Lee for the Crisis magazine, the official magazine of the NAACP. Now, in recent years, of course, we've had a lot of debates about Confederate memorials, Confederate statues, the Confederate flag, and the place of folks like General Lee in American discourse. I'm just going to read part of Du Bois's essay. It's actually quite short, but I just want to read part of it to take the time. In talking about Lee, how he was remembered, Du Bois wrote, "Today we can best perpetuate his memory and his nobler traits, not by falsifying his moral debacle, but by explaining it to the young white South. What Lee did in 1861, other Lees are doing in 1928. They lacked the moral courage to stand up for justice to the Negro because of the overwhelming public opinion of their social environment. Their fathers in the past have condoned lynching and mob violence, just as today they acquiesce in the disenfranchisement of educated and worthy Black citizens, provide wretchedly inadequate public schools for Negro children, and endorse a public treatment of sickness, poverty, and crime, which disgraces civilization. It is the punishment of the South that its Robert Lees and Jefferson Davises will always be tall, handsome, and well-born, that their courage will be physical and not moral, that their leadership will be weak compliance with public opinion and never costly and unswerving revolt for justice and right. It is ridiculous to seek to excuse Robert Lee as the most formidable agency this nation ever raised to make 4 million human beings goods instead of men. Either he knew what slavery meant when he helped maim and murder thousands in its defense, or he did not. If he did not, he was a fool. If he did, Robert Lee was a traitor and a rebel, not indeed to his country, but to humanity and humanity's God." That was W.E.B. Du Bois on Robert E. Lee, March 1928. Any questions? Questions? I know there are probably a few in the chat. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Any questions at all? Yes, go ahead, please.
What were the methods used to convince the non-slaveholding men to fight in the Confederate Army, considering they weren't fighting for their own class interests, but for the ruling class?
This is an excellent question. This is one that historians have been talking about for generations. In short, the question is, how could you convince white non-slaveholding Southerners to fight for slavery? The answer is actually quite simple. They thought that one day they would be slaveholders. Their assumption was that in their, and I'm not being funny when I say this, their belief was that their version of the American dream was to acquire enslaved labor. That perhaps they don't have the money for it now, because buying a slave was actually very expensive. People have done the numbers on this. It was in the equivalent today of thousands upon thousands of dollars. But they felt that if they defended slavery, at some point down the road, they could enter that class of Southerner. That I might not have an enslaved person now, but 5, 10, 15 years from now, I might be able to afford it. Also, to your question, part of it was coercion. The Confederate Congress institutes the draft to force more white Southerners to fight for the Confederate government. And to get out of that draft, you had to own a certain number of enslaved labor or pay a certain amount of money. So again, it's a classic example of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Also, one last thing about that, because I didn't have time to mention this in the actual lecture, but throughout the South in the early to mid 19th century, Southern state governments passed a plethora of laws designed to make sure that poor whites and enslaved Africans had little to no contact whatsoever with each other. Because there was a fear, again, about class interests, that they might join forces and fight against the slaveholding elite. The best example of this was how you had this black market economy of trade between enslaved Africans and poor whites, where they would trade things like alcohol, clothing, foodstuffs, etc. And the slaveholding elite tried to discourage that, but could never break it. Like if you go back and look at laws across the South in the mid 19th century, they're all over the place. So there was an understanding amongst the slaveholding elite that this class interest idea you're talking about could lead to the collapse of slavery. So instead, they gave white Southerners the idea that if you worked long enough and hard enough and saved for money, you too could become a slaveholder.
Dr. Greene, if I carry that forward a little bit, that we see the same thing today. I mean, I have a lot of people have asked me for decades, why do white working people vote against their own interests? And it's that notion, I mean, back then, we're looking at maybe being slave owners, but there's this question of white privilege. And that their white privilege is threatened if they don't toe the line. And that I remember long ago when we were at Grow across the street from one of the mills that was still operating, I knew people that had worked in that mill for 50 years. And this is 1970s. I will go back to 1920. They could come in the front door. They got paid more. So there's these little bits of privilege that historically are happening today in terms of wages, in terms of education, in terms of generational wealth. It's this white privilege thing that's held out for people to side with those people that run the show. And certainly we see that with white working people. We also see that with what Booker T. Washington would call the accommodationists, that were the black people that saw going along accommodating the white power structure advance their interest. It's a question of power relationships.
It's like it goes back to the American dream thing. It's like you can be a millionaire someday, and so you might as well be voting to lower the taxes because that could be you one day.
I have a friend that calls white working people millionaires in waiting.
Exactly, right. And to that point, I know Cecil had a couple of questions in the chat. One of them was about this cartoon I showed earlier, and I'll just briefly answer this question. It was about this cartoon in terms of who this person represents. And yeah, represents the idea of the independent white farmer in the North, which, again, in mid-19th century politics, white independent farmers in the North were an important voting bloc. In fact, when the Republican Party was founded, it was founded on three key ideas: free men, free soil, and free labor. Free men in terms of being citizens, being able to vote, etc. Free labor in terms of being able to control your own labor, not enslaved labor, and free soil, making sure that the land out west was free from slavery and free from competition with slaveholders. I know Cecil also asked the question about why didn't the Supreme Court intervene in the early 19th century with some of these questions about nullification. I'm not 100% sure. My assumption, though, is that the Supreme Court at that time was less willing to take on some of these big arguments within the American political system as it would change later on in the 19th century, become far less reluctant to do so. But I'll look more to that to get a better answer for you.
Dr. Greene, one of the reasons that immigration, the opposition to immigration is a really strong push for Donald Trump and his friends that are clearly working not in the interest of working people, is these people are coming up to take your jobs. And so there's that old trope of they want what you've got that is effective.
Also, one of the great ironies of all this is that the Republican Party in 1860 was staunchly pro-immigration. Yes.
Hammond, James Hammond. Is that person related to Hammond School?
Yeah.
Okay.
This very interesting gentleman with some diverse interests that are, I think, revealed in one of Becky's books. So it was a braggadocio about his what would certainly be considered immoral and illegal sexual peccadillos. A funny guy to name your academy after.
Including his daughters.
Yeah. He was a rather, it's bad when your theories about human beings and mudsill theories, not the worst things about you as a person. He was a terrible human being in terms of sexually assaulting numerous women. He assaulted some of the slaves, folks within his family tree. He's a disgusting person, which is, of course, why we named the school after him. Let's see.
Give me a small name.
James Henry Hammond. Okay, so Cora has a great question. Where did the fleeing slaveholders go after Port Royal was taken? Did they come back when the war was over? Now, this is a great question. So most of the slaveholders at Port Royal, they just fled further inland. They kind of fled into the Midlands, that part of South Carolina. Now, in terms of they returned to Port Royal after the war was over, well, some of them did. And they returned to a very changed place where they no longer had the power and authority they once had. In fact, I'll tell you this right now. We'll get more in depth with this with Reconstruction. But many slaveholders in South Carolina, when slavery came to an end, they were broke because their system of their main source of money was gone. They're no longer working for them. And the slaveholders have to find something to do with the land they still own because they could no longer afford to keep it up, which is going to lead to some really interesting deals with the state government of South Carolina, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks.
Dr. Green, I want to make a small point that's only because I was from Beaufort and Port Royal isn't really what you think of when you're in Beaufort. It was called Port Royal because that's where the port was. That's where the Beaufort fell right at the beginning of the war. And so they moved in and took all the big buildings that were right there. But most of the Freedmen's Bureau and the land occupation and the plantations were not in Port Royal. They were on the Sea Islands on St. Helena, which was a very large place where Penn Center is. But I'm sorry, that's my Beaufort defense of calling it. I'm calling it Port Royal.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because there is in case you're not aware, there is a great national park based in Beaufort. It is the Reconstruction Era National Park, the only national park in the country that deals with Reconstruction. It is based in Beaufort, South Carolina. I actually know some folks who work there. They're very proud of their work. And It's a great place to visit. The folks in Beaufort are also proud of it. What's interesting about Reconstruction Era National Park, however, is that the park is based in Beaufort, but there's also a Reconstruction Trail that goes throughout the country. And it includes places in Columbia. It includes Claflin University, which was founded during Reconstruction. That's my shameless Claflin plug for the day. And so, again, this part of the country has a really unique history that we'll be talking much more about in the next couple of weeks. And I see someone has a suggestion to chat about a field trip to the national park. I would be game for that. We should talk about that and think about how to organize that.
We do have the entirety of Penn Center reserved for a state gathering November 13th, which is the second Saturday after we find out whether we have an autocracy or a continuation of the duopoly.
It's either a celebration or commiseration.
And the building I think we just saw was one of the ones that's still at Penn Center, Dara Hall.
The center of democracy, no matter how dire things get. Yes.
Question. Was Preston Brooks ever censured, or did he get in trouble for beating up
No.
Sumner? Nothing happened?
No, he just beat up Charles Sumner, and he was a hero in the South. I mean, but it is worth noting, putting it in context, not just because of him being Preston Brooks, it's because, as I mentioned before, Congress in the 19th century was an incredibly violent place. We only know Preston Brooks because of how, number one, how thoroughly beaten up Charles Sumner was. Again, he was out of office for close to 2 years. He suffered tremendous brain injuries. And secondly, I think it's because it was Charles Sumner, who was one of the most prominent pro-abolitionist senators in the country at that time, and would later become instrumental with Reconstruction after the Civil War. So in a way, Sumner, he got physically beaten up, but he got his revenge with Reconstruction. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, please, in the back.
Are there any writings of the slaves that participated in the Civil War to fight for their family's liberation? Any righteous indignation writings that they delighted in killing the slave masters?
Well, let me give you an example, because there actually are quite a few writings from enslaved people who fought in the war. Let's see if I can find one here real quick. One of the things about that is some of the Black soldiers who fight in the war, they are doing what you're saying, which is they're enjoying the fact that they're fighting against their former slave master. In fact, there's at least one story from the war of a Black soldier capturing his former slave master in combat.
Did they let him live?
He did actually. He did this weird thing called abiding by the rules of war, which during the Civil War, the Confederates did not. There was a point during the war when the Federal Army first began arming Black soldiers. The Confederates said, all you're doing is fomenting slave revolt. If we capture a Black soldier in combat, they'll be sold into slavery. In response, President Lincoln ends the prisoner of war exchange program between North and South as a protest. And so, like in many Civil War battles, when you have Black soldiers fighting, the casualty numbers on both sides are terrible, because the Black soldiers are literally fighting to not be enslaved. And so they fight even harder than their white counterparts. But to your question, I want to show you just one quick thing. And if you do a search on Google, you can find a lot of primary sources of Black soldiers' letters. This is one really good one, though. It's from American Yawp. American Yawp is this great free textbook online of American history. And it also includes a primary source database. And this is actually a letter from William Henry Singleton, who fought for the Union, but it was written in 1922, so generations after the war was over. And he talks about trying to join the war early on and how initially he is refused. But what you see here is that he and his colleagues at the AME Zion Church in New Bern, I think that's Ohio. What's that?
Near Wilmington?
No, this is actually in the north, I think. Could be wrong though. I'll check on this to make sure.
New Bern is in North Carolina. Go ahead.
Let me see. Okay, I'll get back to that later. It could be Newport, North Carolina, but what they're trying to do is form a regiment. And initially they're told no. I'll just quote directly, and apologies for the language. And Colonel Leggett told him, quote, "We will never take niggers in the army to fight. The war will be over before your people ever get in." Well, that's not true. The war will drag on for several more years. They actually formed a group of men who were ready to fight at any moment. And eventually, he even talks to President Lincoln, trying to get the president's support to form a colored regiment. And eventually they do. Eventually he gets a chance to fight in 1863. And actually, you're right. It was Newport, North Carolina, because they formed the first North Carolina colored regiment.
You know how I know that? That's my great grandfather.
Are you serious? Wow.
He had pluck.
I see where you get it from now. Like, man, this is extraordinary. This is why I love doing this. Like, that's just incredible.
That's really cool.
Man, that's awesome. You know what this means, right? We gotta make this required reading every year from Justice School. We have to add this to the list of readings. No, I will. That's incredible. Wow.
Do the hand, but I wanted to point out that there's a lot of commentary in this study guide for this class about things that were written about Preston Brooks and the caning. And it depends which newspaper you're reading, whether he's a hero or a villain, but it's a contemporaneous lifting of stuff.
But also, before I get to your question, real quick with your question about writings, you have a lot of diaries written by Black soldiers during the war, a lot of letters written before or during and after the war. And I would also recommend looking at the writings of George Washington Williams, who was a Black historian, who's before Carter G. Woodson, before Du Bois, who's writing about Black history in the 1880s. And he's collecting stories from Black soldiers who fought in the war about 20 years after it was fought. So yes, there are plenty of writings from Black soldiers who fought in the war, and many of them express maybe not revenge, but certainly justice in fighting against the Confederates. Although I think they would have been justified in fighting with revenge too, but I digress. Yes, your question, please.
All right. When you start to have those proto-fascist beliefs about the nature of the African Americans, making them suitable for slavery, and it's like that, who are fit to rule who? When does like Christianity start getting incorporated into that? Like, because I know that eventually they started using like this is where God put you, that like God put you in this place to be ruled over.
Obedient to the slave.
Right. Well, I would say that it was already baked into the system. And what I mean by that is, well before the mudsilk theory in the 18th century, and even going back further than that, you have Europeans and white Americans justifying slavery through Christian doctrine. Or when they're exposing the enslaved to Christianity, they're leaving out the story of Moses and the Promised Land and leaving in lines about you should obey your master at all times, so on and so forth. But also to your question, what you see in the run-up to the Civil War is that national churches are also splitting along regional and sectional lines, primarily over the issue of slavery. So a lot of churches are split in two. They have a northern section and a southern section that teach very different things from the Bible about slavery and justice and your rewards on earth versus in heaven. During the war, both sides are talking about they're fighting for God. God is on their side. In fact, there's a famous line from President Lincoln where he says, if we're being honest, we don't know which side God is on. We just hope we're on God's side. But religion has a pivotal role to play with that because it provides some of the fuel for how hyper-partisan things become. Everything by 1860 is wrapped up in this question of slavery, and that includes the various churches of the country at that time: Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, etc.
And So is that like, I heard one time that's why the African American Methodist Church exists. Did that kind of split off at this time or was that later?
That was actually much earlier. Are you talking about the AME Church?
Yes.
Yes, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is coming along in the late 18th century. But they are created because Richard Allen in Philadelphia in the 1790s is thoroughly disgusted with how the Methodist Church, Episcopal Church of Philadelphia, was literally segregated on race. So like if you were Black going to that church in Philadelphia, you had to sit in a certain part of the church. Allen leaves the church with his followers and forms the AME Church. But the AME Church becomes seen as a threat in the South because it's a Black-run church and it's a Black-run institution. Remember, with Denmark VC's rebellion, the rebellion is planned in the Emmanuel AME Church. So again, as we see here, everything comes back to slavery in some form or fashion.
Dr. Bain, I want to mention something for those that haven't grown up in the South or in places where you heard with regularity, that's the way it was. Well, the way it was depended on who you were.
Yeah.
And then I've heard all my life that was, oh, that's just what people were used to. They didn't have to think about it. At the same time, there were abolitionists fighting that were white, that were endangering their own lives, and certainly people of color resisting it. And so that analysis is temporal. It depends on who you are and where you're standing at the time. Because I think morality is something that crosses those race and timelines, but gets rewritten by the winners, who quite often are not the moralists of the era.
All right, one last question. Go ahead.
Well, maybe just to share, so John C. Calhoun, his legacy, I'm from Minneapolis originally, and there's a chain of lakes that are just kind of beautiful places. One of them was Lake Calhoun. He'd never stepped foot in Minnesota or Wisconsin territory, but he had been admired by someone who was stationed there. There's been a fight for a number of years about the naming of the lake. They've changed the name now to the Dakota name, Modjeska. So now the lake is no longer Lake Calhoun, but Modjeska.
Actually, to that point, I just want to add this, and I think we're at 8:29, so we got to get ready to sing pretty soon. But one thing about Calhoun and other Southern leaders is that they receive like memorials and statues all across the country. But with Calhoun especially, he is important for this class because if you think about many of the ideas on the conservative right, if you go back long enough, you can trace many of them to John C. Calhoun, especially about the relationship between state governments and the federal government, and also ideas about limiting democracy and making it seem democratic in the process. Calhoun was really part of that lineage of South Carolinians who were very critical of the expansion of democracy and democratic rights. Something we're going to see in dramatic fashion with Reconstruction. So again, before we sing and find new ways to ruin our vocal cords, just a friendly reminder, next Monday, April 1st, we're going to have a gathering here to watch the Modjeska Simkins documentary that was made by ETV in the 1980s. And then we'll have a discussion afterwards starting at 6:30. We'd love for you to join us next week. And the week after that is a very small event called Reconstruction, and looking at how that moment was the moment where South Carolina was at its most small d democratic.
And the Constitution that we're still living under was written in 1895 that we get to later, but the 1868 Constitution was the one that Dr. Greene referred to as the most democratic, perhaps in the nation's history.
See, not everything about our state's history is bad, just most of it. Also in the chat, it says this Friday in Charleston, at Charleston Worker Center, we have a screening of the short film, Fight to Free the Charleston Five. So they're doing that in Charleston this week as well.
You want to say something about what you're doing Thursday?
Thank you so much. Yes, and the United Campus Workers Union for folks who are in Columbia or would like to visit in Columbia. I have these brochures I'll pass to you. But Thursday at 3:30 on the historic Horseshoe, which is a site of many historic struggles, for justice and peace and freedom. We will be delivering our petition for living wages, and this United Campus Workers is a union of all workers at USC, including staff, faculty, graduate students, and we're calling for living wages, organizing for living wages for all. So we're going to deliver that petition with a rally and a march on the Horseshoe this Thursday at 3:30, and you can find more information about the campaign and the action in these brochures, which I'm about to leave on.
That's fantastic.
So I know we need to get back to Greene of